Studium to Studio with your local lay Dominicans, we'll be discussing some of the gems we've discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican chapter and co-host of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
Jeff Drozda,
Michael Totaro.
Today we're going to talk about epistemology. Okay, we probably need to explain that if you're tired and coming home from work, you're like, okay, don't make me think. So we're going to keep it simple, but also make it fun. It's thinking. It's actually a study of thinking. Am I correct, Mike?
Study of knowledge.
Study of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's dive into it. Mike's been studying some of this, right?
Yes.
And so we're going to lean heavily on him to walk us through a deeper an understanding of epistemology.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. Yeah, no pressure, of course. Right? Yeah.
None, doctor, right? Yeah, you can.
So, yes, epistemology is the philosophical study of the nature, origin, and limits of human knowledge. And so basically it's referred to as the theory of knowledge. Mm. And it has been, it has a long history, especially in the West and Western philosophy. And so, we quite often will sort of lump together these notions of, intellect, knowledge, thinking, and in contemporary times, information and data. And of course, there are relationships, but as a field of study, epistemology is very important, and it's very relevant today because we live, as we know, in a world that is all too often kind of relativistic and defining truth.
So help me understand this, is that obviously we are in search of truth, and so it's a matter of perceiving or finding the knowledge, the truth, and where our senses come in, all this kind of stuff, which, it can be a little confusing, but it really boils down to, is from what I think St. Thomas, calls the knower and the known, and, being able to for all these things to come together. So, when did this theory begin? I mean, is there a father or mother of epistemology?
Yeah, so not surprisingly, as with many, I guess, important ideas, at least in the West, the Western world, the pre-Socratics, those who preceded Socrates, okay, so we call them the pre-Socratics, ancient Greek philosophy. They basically this whole thing began as this desire to understand motion, the problem of motion. And so as a result, at that early stage of what we call epistemology today, many of the pre-Socratic philosophers thought that there was no such thing as a logically coherent account of motion and change. So if that were the case, right, as they thought it was, then knowledge was unchanging. We have to then distinguish between knowledge, which is kind of the focus of today's discussion, and when we are trying to determine the objective truth about something. How do we come to know that something is what it really is? You mentioned, Jeff, our senses. Our senses are very important, obviously, in terms of our being able to have an awareness about the world around us, but we also know that our senses can play tricks on us. They're not always reliable. And
for example, and I go back to philosophy class, and many moons ago, is that, okay, you have this table in front of you, you put your hand on it, and is that table moving? Well, my senses indicate from my touch and from my sight that no, that table is not moving. However, we know that it is. We know that there are particles. We know there are molecules that are constantly moving.
Or do we?
And that, well, I don't know, do we?
Yes.
Because that is the question, I guess something that people find fun to do is do we really know? And I think we go back and we need to look at what knowledge is to begin with, because if we're going to do the study of knowledge, then what is knowledge as opposed to what I believe? So that seems to be the crux of it. So if I believe something is happening, then it's not necessarily knowledge unless it is happening, as you were saying. However, if I have evidence of this happening, then this is knowledge, right? So I've heard it described as the true justified belief, which is something that Plato came up with. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
So that would be the definition of knowledge, is something that we believe is justified and there's evidence for it.
Right. And of course, there are different sources of knowledge, and we've actually sort of, kind of talked about this in prior segments, especially when speaking about we search for truth in several different ways. There's reason, okay, so we can reason our way and discover some truth about something. There's also empirical observation. There's evidence, as you mentioned that a few minutes ago. That's scientific sort of approaches that lead us to empirical truths. Subjective truth, but only in the sense that, in the context of given what we've observed. So for example, we observe that the sun rises every morning, but we also know that there will come a time when that won't happen, right? And just because it's done it for billions of years thus far doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow necessarily. So in science, things are either you can't prove anything in science, right? So you can either disprove it or not disprove it. And then, of course, there's divine revelation, right? And of course, we can't forget, this is, I think, the pinnacle of what I think our thought should be when we speak about epistemology, and that is our minds become illuminated, and this is a notion by St. Augustine, by God. And that's how we have the capacity to develop knowledge and understanding about objective reality.
And that's sort of a more advanced, as we're building the edifice of epistemology, we're advancing to, those parts of it that are telling us what are the cause of our knowledge. So before we get there, can we say there's a question that a lot of people ask, which is, can we have knowledge? Which is why I asked that question earlier, do we actually know it? And some of the pre-Socratics, the sophists, were skeptics, and they had political reasons for sort of controlling people by being advancing skepticism as well as relativism. Anybody recognize that today? I mean, can we recognize that today? So we need the remedy, which Socrates and Plato and Aristotle came along, and in deference to that, those sophists who were controlling people by this, they started saying we can have a rational thought. We do have this ability, and this is the beginning of, our thoughts on epistemology.
Right. Yes.
So now we're getting to a point where we answer, can we have knowledge? And the sophists would have said no. The skeptics say no, in which case it's ironic because they can't really say that, can they? That it's self-defeating to say there is no knowledge because you can't make that statement even.
Exactly, and in fact, along those similar lines, the pre-Socratics, one of the probably most well-known individuals that so he was not necessarily a sophist, but his name was Parmenides, and he was a 5th century BCE philosopher, and basically he was really kind of the philosopher, the Greek philosopher, who posited that it is impossible to think of change. There is no change. And surprisingly, at least maybe for some people, Plato actually accepted this notion that knowledge must be unchanging. However, and the reason, by the way, is because he had his sort of sort of skeptical. Plato was sort of skeptical about the reliability of sense experience, right? And so this then leads us to Plato's the Platonic theory of knowledge, and probably the most well-known sort of literary device used by Plato was his allegory of the cave.
Right.
And so that appears in Book 7 of his Republic. And basically what Plato teaches us in that allegory is that we're like people who live in a cave. And so obviously we can only see, the light is from behind us, and what we see are shadows against the wall that's in front of us. So we only see shadows, okay? And so what we consider as, so Jeff, going back to your table sort of example earlier, so Plato would say that this particular table that we're sitting adjacent to is not that it's not real, but it is not the important reality. The important reality is what the table is, the form of the table, the idea of the table. So the table as it is a table, not this particular thing. And that's pretty interesting when you think about it, because, and Aquinas, of course, eventually, well, Aristotle, then Aquinas after Aristotle, takes this notion to a new height and basically says, when we come upon a person, whether it's a person we know or a person we don't know, in our mind, we first acknowledge the existence of a being who is alive. If it's a human being, well, it's man or woman. So we begin with universals, and this is, again, takes us to this notion of form and matter. So our minds basically latch onto the form, or the what it is type of thing, the nature first. Obviously, when I see both of you, right, I know who you are, but still my mind recognizes you as living human beings. And then, so again, we start from this sort of highest, most abstract, or level of abstraction, universal. And then very quickly bring it down to, oh, this is Jeff and Cheryl.
So when we are talking about these things, we've already answered that question, can we have knowledge? Yes, right? We're saying we're realist or dogmatist is what another term for that, right? We believe that the realist, that we can have knowledge. And I think some of the things you're mentioning with Plato, I've heard described also as Plato having an amnesia concept, where we don't actually write on our tablets, the blank slate idea. We don't do that. It's there. The forms are there. And somehow we pull into that, over time, we draw from that form, that greater form, which is not, it's not quite on. He's getting somewhere. He has part of something. And then along comes Aristotle, who's very earthy. And this is why if you've seen that wonderful, what is that painting called? I'm thinking, The Academy,
yes,
where they're walking along and, Plato looking up at the form, focused up there, and Aristotle focused to the earth. And then we've got, St. Thomas right in the middle, who's very much pulling from both of those concepts. He gets the fullness of what Plato was going for, because it was before Christ and before an understanding of our salvation history. And anyway, let's explore some more about, if we go into realist thoughts, how can we get knowledge? And that's what we're sort of talking about right now. How can we get this knowledge?
So if we think of scientific truth, okay, so it's accomplished by means of what are known as syllogisms. And this was, by the way, the idea of this form of argument called syllogism was invented by Aristotle himself in his Posterior Analytics. And so an example would be, for example, we have the statement, all stars are distant objects, okay, which we know that's a true statement. all distant objects twinkle, therefore all stars twinkle. That's a simple example of a syllogism. That is deriving knowledge by way of reason. Once again, bringing it back to the way the way science really should work is that one makes observations. And what does one observe? What does the scientist observe? The scientist observes observables, so particulars, and then looks for some sort of patterns from which then generalizations could be made. So empirical, that kind of knowledge acquisition is really inductive logic, knowledge, because we're beginning with what we observe and we sort of work backward. We're looking at the effects and we're trying to determine the cause. And then once we can identify patterns from those observables, then we can formulate these sort of universal notions. Then from that point forward, we can then take a syllogistic approach, right? Because now we've got something that we can say, well, again, we have to distinguish, by the way, between like formal logic, such as what you might find in pure mathematics, because mathematical proofs are, if they're correct, they are airtight, logically speaking. Scientific arguments, on the other hand, are not airtight proofs. They're merely because they're based upon empirical observations. Nonetheless, knowledge is still acquired. This is important, once again, tying it back to something that we spoke to earlier in this particular segment, and that is today we have this plethora, this amazing kind of sort of disaster happening where people have somehow confused opinion and facts. So I might formulate an opinion about something, but is that actually knowledge? Whereas if I state a fact about something, well, then that is based upon some objective truth. But today there seems to be this kind of there's a blur. And so if you don't really agree with what I'm trying to promote or whatever, then you don't really have knowledge. You're a fool, right? That's really a problem because, and we've seen that so much has gotten watered down. In fact, I guess a case in point, recently there was kind of this notable figure in, I guess, he's a comedian, and he made a comment which really was heartbreaking. He just basically, and I'm not quoting, just paraphrasing, mention his name, but he basically said that yes, that would be pro-life, pro-life individuals. They claim that abortion is murder, and I suppose it is, he said. But there are almost 8 billion people in the world, and so I think he's like, well, it's sorry, but you really won't be missed very much.
I think his quote was, "And I'm okay with that."
Yes.
That's where we have, I guess, digressed in our society. And, these are major influencers, and I don't want to say leaders, but, because it's entertainment / political commentary, and that's what we're hearing day in and day out, especially in the evening. You're hearing these things. And so if you're tuning in late, and if you don't realize you're listening to a bunch of Dominicans, I'm here to tell you you are. And you're listening to Christ Our King Catholic Radio for Acadiana at 90.5 FM and 99.5 FM and 1230 AM. We are your third order Dominicans, your lay Dominicans, based out of Our Lady of Wisdom Church here in Lafayette, Louisiana. And this is our show where we bring the fruits of our contemplation to the studio. So it's studium to studio, and we want to thank Stein Lumber for their sponsorship, because that's what allows us to share our fruits of our contemplation to you. And once again, Stein Lumber with stores and locations throughout all of Acadiana. So we're talking about knowledge, we're talking about epistemology, and we're the last example that you gave us, Mike, was something that is disturbing, but you have to be able to break down, what they are saying is logical. And, we throw out truths and logics, and, your truth is not my truth now. And so your logic is,
right.
And that's where we find ourselves are today. How can epistemology help put us back on track? Can it? I mean, can we use still the same tenets that Aristotle and St. Thomas used to help get us back where we need to be?
I think the answer is yes, we can. But we don't. And the good news is we don't have to change a thing in terms of the core principles of Aristotelian Thomistic epistemology. That's the good news. The not so good news is, like, going back to your question just moments ago. I mean, can we sort of, help bring about a change in our society, which is clearly just, it's just spiraling downward with this illogical thinking? Because it does seem, at least to me, that there is really not a great deal of interest by the masses for what is really truth. It's just a matter of what I want. And again, what you said, your truth, my truth. But as Dominicans, veritas, truth. Truth is truth. So the knowledge that we want to acquire is proper and right knowledge, as our minds are illuminated by God. He's given us this capacity to do so, but we do have that free will that can be misused, of course.
And understanding all of this will help us when we're being sort of attacked by these thoughts, and this bad way of thinking can sometimes really be persuasive if we're not clear on how we are capable of knowing, that we are capable of knowledge, and the ways that we learn. And I think, one thing that I know we should get to before we finish up is that how do we know about God's existence? And I think that's the important thing, because God gives, like you said, and I think that St. Thomas Aquinas did combine some Plato and some Aristotle and came up, and even more and beyond, to give us the idea that our senses can, to some degree, be trusted. There is a experiential reality. We also are illumined by God. Everything comes from Him, even our sense abilities. There is a truth that is outside of us, right? And we can access that, at least with our limited, finite minds. We can know something about that infinite and be raised up to a higher thinking. And so that's what we want to get to. And part of that is what we talked about, before. There has to be evidence. And sometimes that's experiential evidence. And sometimes it's spiritual evidence that we have a spiritual encounter with God ourselves. And we need to stay in prayer to be able to access that light of God and to shed that light in our minds. And I think oftentimes when I'm navigating a situation or see something in the media that doesn't seem right, it doesn't take me long, if I stay in prayer, to see clearly which side is up and which is down. I think, unfortunately, I see a lot of people ending up not seeing it clearly, because it's so easy to be bamboozled if you're not staying connected to the light, to God.
Yes, and we need to look no further than Genesis, right? The very first original sin by Adam and Eve, and basically how it all, and we talked about this in previous segments, right? It all kind of goes back to this notion of we want to be like God, right? And it's pride. It's pride. And so and throughout all of history, human history, we see it time and again, and even in our own lives. Well, I mean, I can't speak for anyone else other than myself. I will say this, hint, hint, thank God for confession, the sacrament of confession, because, I try, but I do fall, but I thank God for His love and His forgiveness and His mercy. And 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 Cheryl, you mentioned about like the different kinds of knowledge, and so we might as well just kind of just tackle a bit of Aquinas at this point. So he identifies different kinds of knowledge. There's sensory knowledge, which is what we've already spoken to. So that arises from sensing particular things. This notion of particular things is relevant, okay? Because it has individual things as its object, this table or this book or whatever, and is shared with brute animals, because brute animals also have this sort of sensory knowledge, okay? But sensory knowledge is, at least according to Aquinas, is a lower form of knowledge than scientific knowledge, okay? Which is characterized by generality. And that's something that we kind of spoke to earlier. So again, science is not concerned with studying particulars, but rather to derive universal principles or knowledge based upon observations and experimentation with particulars.
And just to give an example of that, because I think just because some of those words sound difficult, but it's basically the idea that we can look at trees and walk around trees that we know that are in our area, the cypress and so forth, and we don't have to know a tree that's not in our area, that when we go visit there to know it's a tree. Yes. We already have sort of a concept of what a tree is. It goes up to a principle, a universal, like you were saying, that we get this understanding of what a tree is. And even if it's a strange looking tree, a ginkgo tree or something somewhere else, we can still tell it's a tree because our reasoning helps us to go from that sensory, we abstract, and then we can have an understanding, a grasp of the essence of what a tree is and apply it to other trees.
Right, because every tree will have that essence.
Right.
I mean, it's because the nature...
The treeness.
The treeness, exactly. Dog, the dogness.
You want the word is quiddity. Quiddity.
Yes, quiddity. Yes, that's right, yes.
So, yeah, tell us more. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, that's okay. And so continuing with so this leads us really to, so what is at an even higher level than scientific knowledge, and that is God's knowledge. Aquinas says that God's knowledge is the most detailed of all. No surprise there, right? So Aquinas thought that though the highest knowledge humans can possess is knowledge of God, so you asked about, how can we know that there really is God? Knowledge of physical objects is better suited to human capabilities, and so that's sort of what he does spend some time in the Summa Theologiae sort of speaking to that, the kind of knowledge that of physical objects. So that's sort of this realist, like you said, earthy,
right?
With Aristotle, earthy, and again Aquinas picked that up and he kind of ran with it, as it were. So really excellent source to learn about Thomistic epistemology is a book entitled Man's Knowledge of Reality, subtitled An Introduction to Thomistic Epistemology by Frederick Wilhelmsen.
And one book that we studied, or I guess 4-volume book, was Dr. Peter Kreeft's Socrates' Children, the 100 Greatest Philosophers. And it was a wonderful introduction to a lot of philosophers and philosophies. And a way that he summarizes St. Thomas's epistemology is this: the created material world is the means by which God communicates his ideas to our minds. So human science is the reading of divine art. And what a beautiful way to end our show and to say, remember to stand firm in the absolute truth, Jesus Christ, because only the truth bears grace. God bless.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past, stared at death and it stared back, standing fast in the light of the word. A shotgun blast was the last thing I heard. I rattled in the wind like a window pane. The soul's alright, but my body...